December 1993. A gunman opens fire on a Long Island Railroad car packed with commuters.
Everybody's running crazy. I see blood all over.
The nation is transfixed when the accused shooter acts as his own attorney.
This is a case of stereotype victimization of a black man.
Are these the words of a madman or a calculating killer's finest performance?
He had cast himself in a leading role, which nobody had anticipated.
On December 7th, 1993, Robert Giuliano is on his daily commute home from work in New York City to Long Island.
Got on the train, headed out of Penn Station on the 533 to Mineola, which I take to Maryland Avenue. 14 years I had a business in the city, and that was my car. Third car, third seat. You met the same people every night. I may not have known them intimately or personally, because you know what? Everybody had their place, and it was nice, until it was disrupted. We got to Jamaica Station, and I remember this woman, young girl came on. Beautiful, angelic face, very pretty girl. He said, "Is this seat taken?" I said, "No." Started going.
The train pulls out of Jamaica Station and heads towards Mineola.
We get to New Hyde Park, and at that point I get up. I have a briefcase, and I wait by the door for the next stop. As soon as the door closes, I hear shooting. I was in a maze. Is this a movie? I'm looking down this. I see blood all over. Everybody's running crazy.
Over the next 3 minutes, the man shoots 25 people. Robert Giuliano is one of them.
The gun went like this. One went over my head, and one went through my arm into my chest. I didn't know I was shot. I didn't feel the pain. I didn't feel the sting, nothing like that. I looked around and thought I was being tackled. There was nobody there. At that point, it got quiet. There was no more shooting. And I started gasping for air. I couldn't breathe. At that point, that's when they jumped him.
Paramedics and police rushed to the Maryland Avenue station. Meanwhile, 47-year-old Joyce Gurecki is expecting her husband, James, to arrive home from work at any moment. But that night, he's late.
He was like an angel. Everybody loved him. He was just one of the nicest people you could ever meet. My neighbor told my daughter that there was a shooting at the station in Garden City. So I really was getting very worried. So around 10:30, the doorbell rang. I opened the door, and the two detectives were there. And I said, "He got killed, didn't he?" And they said, "Yes." And with that, I fell to the floor.
James Gurecki, 2 other men, and 2 young women were dead. Another young woman died at the hospital soon afterward. She was the 6th victim. 19 others were wounded. For the survivors, this would be just the beginning of their ordeal. The man who passengers had tackled is 35-year-old Colin Ferguson, a well-educated immigrant from a wealthy Jamaican family. He had been caught, literally, with a smoking gun. In his pockets, police find handwritten notes entitled, "Reasons for This," which suggests the attack was racially motivated. At first glance, it looks like an open and shut case. Despite everything, Ferguson claims an unidentified white man was the real killer and that he had escaped. With a train full of witnesses, Ferguson is clearly delusional or a liar. He insists he is perfectly sane, but his court-appointed attorney thinks differently. He announces that despite Ferguson's claims, he will pursue a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. But Ferguson rejects the plea and refuses to cooperate. Instead, he talks to leading civil rights attorney Ronald Kuby, who has a track record of successfully defending difficult cases.
We didn't claim that Colin was sane, but the form the insanity took was what we deemed to be black rage.
Colin Ferguson stands accused of being the sole triggerman in a hate-fueled shooting spree on the Long Island Railroad. Rejecting an insanity plea by his court-appointed attorneys, Ferguson seeks out leading civil rights attorney Ronald Kuby.
We had just been following the case in the media, and then after a month or two had gone by, and there had been much more explication about racism and about Colin Ferguson's claims of racism, statements about race, his specific stated desire to kill white people. It was at that point that he contacted our office.
Kuby and his partner, William Kunstler, agreed to take Ferguson's case and begin to formulate their defense. Although they agree with Ferguson's public defender that their client is insane, they take a different approach, one that is grounded in Ferguson's past. Colin Ferguson was born in Jamaica. The son of a wealthy businessman, he graduated from high school in the top third of his class. In his early 20s, he moved to the U.S., but found he was only offered menial jobs. He began to feel a burning sense of injustice.
For the first time, he began to encounter systematic, institutionalized racism in the United States. Didn't encounter it in Jamaica, had grown up thinking that he was no different than anybody else, and soon got to the United States and learned differently.
Over the years, Ferguson gradually slid deeper into paranoia, becoming convinced that the world was conspiring against him. In the notes found on Ferguson, his rants about his sense of racial injustice gave Kuby and Kunstler their strategy for his defense.
We didn't claim that Colin was sane. We were claiming that because of his delusional, paranoid state, he was not criminally responsible. He was not guilty by reason of insanity. But the form the insanity took was what we deemed to be black rage.
Initially, Ferguson is supportive of Kuby's black rage defense, even though it relies on the assumption that he is guilty and insane. In the meantime, prosecutor George Peck prepares to argue the opposite, that at the time of the shooting, Ferguson was not criminally insane. To prove it, he must demonstrate that Ferguson knew what he was doing, and that he knew what he was doing was wrong. For Peck's prosecution, Ferguson's notes are equally important, as they suggest he had carefully planned the attack. They also clearly explain that he didn't choose New York City as the venue due to Ferguson's respect for David Dinkins, New York's first black mayor. Ferguson had sat on the train and waited until they crossed into Nassau County before he opened fire.
This is obviously an indication by Ferguson that he doesn't want to embarrass Dinkins. And if you don't want to embarrass someone, you know what you're doing is wrong.
The stage is set for a trial that will ask whether Ferguson was driven mad by racial discrimination to the point that he was not responsible for his actions, or was he a calculating killer? But 5 months after choosing Kuby as his lawyer, Ferguson rejects the black rage defense. He again insists he is innocent and then accuses his own counsel of being part of the conspiracy against him. Kuby remains convinced Ferguson is insane, too crazy even to recognize that insanity is his only real defense.
The craziest people in the world are the ones who insist that there's nothing wrong with them. It's everybody else who has the problem. And Colin was very, very much in that category.
Under New York law, a defendant must be sane enough to assist in his own defense if there is to be a trial. With Ferguson rejecting what Kuby thinks is his only defense, he demands the court re-examine Ferguson's competency. If the judge rules Ferguson is incompetent, there won't be a trial at all.
There wasn't a lot of difference between the two sides in terms of the psychiatric evaluation, but for the standards of competence, all you have to do is to be able to understand the nature of the proceedings and assist in your own defense in the most rudimentary way. So in essence, if you know the difference between a judge and a grapefruit, you're competent to stand trial.
On December 10th, 1994, the judge is ready to deliver his decision. He again rules that Ferguson is competent to stand trial. Then, Ferguson makes a move that stuns everyone. Against all advice, he fires Kuby and says he will defend himself. What would follow is one of the most bizarre courtroom spectacles anyone had ever seen.
It's going to be mental illness theater. It's going to be all of us sucked into Colin Ferguson's own delusional behavior with the aid of the prosecutor.
On January 26, 1995, the trial begins of the accused gunman in the Long Island Railroad Massacre. What would follow is one of the most bizarre courtroom spectacles anyone had ever seen. Choosing to represent himself, Colin Ferguson, referring to himself in the third person, denies being the shooter.
The evidence will show that Colin Ferguson was in fact a well-meaning passenger on the train. This is a case of stereotype victimization of a black man and subsequent conspiracy to destroy him.
He was a very intelligent individual.
What's the sense of people pointing fingers when there were inconsistencies in their police statements and their grand jury statements? Who do you believe?
I don't know what he was reading, but for someone who's never been in a courtroom before, he was comfortable.
Ferguson takes on the demeanor of a seasoned defense attorney.
Someone opened the bag, took the weapon out of the bag, and proceeded to shoot. It is at that point that Mr. Ferguson was awakened by the gunfire and himself, amidst the confusion, sought to protect himself, sought to run for cover like any other person on that train.
You had a man who looked like a lawyer, sounded like a lawyer, but this was a crazy person and doing a superb job of acting, which put the judge and the prosecutor in the position of really being supporting players in Colin Ferguson's mental illness reenactment.
As Ferguson continues, his delusions become more and more apparent.
There were 93 counts to that indictment. 93 counts, only because it matches the year 1993. Had it been 1925, it would have been 25 counts.
No matter what defense we used or didn't use, no matter what lawyer he had or didn't have, he was always going to do this. He was always going to represent himself. This was his shot at greatness.
For the survivors, Ferguson's performance in court is difficult to watch, but their greatest challenge is yet to come. A week into the trial, passenger Robert Giuliano begins to tell the jury the gruesome details of what he saw that evening on the train.
Pointing to the left, pointing to the right, walked up a few feet, pointed in this. Whoever was in front of me just went like this, random. Two girls that took the train, I used to call them the blonde sisters, and I just said, he's got a gun, get down. And I pushed them down and just get down. This girl who was sitting next to me, she got up and started crawling, and before you know it, he was about 10 feet away, and she picked her head up and he looked at her, and he pointed and shot her. Looked like her head exploded. I found out it was in her neck, and the blood was it just went all over me. I would have done something, but I couldn't. It took me a long time to get over that, not being able to control that situation. He looked me in the eyes, square in the face. I'm looking at you right now. And he pointed his gun at me.
Almost all of those wounded in the attack testify against Ferguson.
He looked me dead in the eye and pointed the gun, and with the most serious look I have ever seen on anyone's face, he shot me in the chest.
Worst of all, the survivors must face being cross-examined by the very person they saw shoot them.
They gathered strength from each other, and for the most part, they couldn't wait to face him.
Surviving witnesses in the Long Island Railroad Massacre prepare to be cross-examined by none other than the accused gunman himself, Colin Ferguson.
I watched you reach over the top of one seat with your right hand and shoot down into it.
I saw you shooting everyone on the train, okay?
Marianne Phillips, the first person to be shot, played dead to avoid being shot again. Ferguson tries to argue that that means she couldn't have seen him.
The only time you have seen the suspect is on TV. Am I correct?
I saw you shoot me, and I've seen you on TV.
I was one of the last to be questioned. And I stood out. I'm like, I'm looking at you right now for 32 minutes. Never took my eyes off him. Pulled everything I had inside of me, got all my strength up, and I said, this guy's not going to beat me again.
Is it your testimony that the defendant Ferguson stood right in front of you and shot you?
You weren't right in front of me. You were about 10 to 12 feet away, approximately distance we're at about now.
But even in the face of so much evidence, Ferguson maintains the defendant is innocent. In a rambling closing argument, more than a year after he was first indicted, Ferguson accuses the many witnesses who testified against him of conspiring with the authorities to convict him. On February 17, 1995, Ferguson is found guilty on multiple charges, including all 6 counts of murder. A month later, survivors and victims' family members file into court to testify during sentencing. For 3 days, those affected by the Railroad Massacre ask the judge to punish Ferguson as severely as possible. Joyce Goricki reads a letter written by her 11-year-old daughter.
It feels so unreal. I still try to remember his voice. I wish my dad could see me graduate. He still will from above, and I hope he is proud.
Robert Giuliano also takes the stand.
I witnessed Colin Ferguson murder Maria McToto, whose blood was spilled on my clothes. She didn't have a chance.
Still, throughout the victim's statements, Ferguson seems to be barely listening.
Remember these eyes. You're nothing but a piece of garbage. You're at the end. 5 minutes, that's all I need. 5 minutes.
During the trial, the death sentence had been reinstated in New York for murder, but Ferguson would not face execution. His crimes had occurred before the law was passed. Instead, Colin Ferguson is sentenced to more than 300 years in jail.
You, Colin Ferguson, will never again return to society, but rather will spend the rest of your natural life in prison.
He went away for life, 300 some odd years for the rest of his life, 23 hours a day in a 6x8 jail cell. I'd rather be dead before I do that.